Hi, everyone. My name is Chua. Thanks so much for this invitation to respond to Nicole Grove's keynote on engineered disruption. I found this concept immensely generative to think with, and I look forward to our panel discussion. So in her generative opening to this forum, Nicole Grove poses a question. If amidst growing social uncertainties and hazards, understandings and experiences of risk have prompted an ever-present politics of preemption, might we be witnessing a parallel emergence of engineered disruption? Are state and corporate elites turning uncertainty and disruption into an object for experimentation, an ends rather than a means? So I want to use Grove's provocation today to think both with and against the kinds of political modalities and relations that an age of design disruption might bring forth, and to do so through a strand of research I've been interested in for some time about the relationship between the growth of mega infrastructural projects, the futures they gesture towards, and what they say about our current stage of late capitalism. So the idea of disruption or disruptive innovation, widely dubbed the most influential business idea of the early 21st century, was first coined by Clayton Christensen in a book called The Innovator's Dilemma in 1997. And it has become the rallying cry of Silicon Valley, right? Because it identifies the value of disruption not as a descriptive analytic, but as a predictive tool. For Christensen, disruptive innovation occurs when a paradigm-shifting technological change upsets the dominant technology in a given industry so that the expertise and scale that a company has built up over decades is suddenly displaced by a cheaper and poorer quality commodity that eventually replaces the whole industry. So we might think, of course, of Uber's destruction of the taxi industry, the personal computer's displacement of mainframe computers, so on and so forth. And so in the business world, disruption is a tantalizing concept, not because of the risks it poses, but for the potential opportunities it affords. It is meant to be a predictive tool that offers investors a kind of promise of the future, a roadmap that says disrupt or be disrupted. As we know, this logic, of course, has become pervasive, right? Anything from pillowcases to cars have become targets for disruption. But what does it mean to invest in a future of engineered disruption? And what becomes sites of a disinvestment in turn? Rather than speculate, I think about what might be new about this age, I find it productive then to return to recent histories, specifically to the long downturn in advanced industrialized economies. So beginning in the 1970s, amid crises of profitability and rising labor unrest, industrial capital began to depart the US and advanced industrialized countries in search of cheaper labor, leaving abandoned factories and unemployment in its wake. This is the deindustrialization narrative that many of us are probably familiar with. And as the rate of return on investments in industrial production had been on a steady decline, the FIRE sector, so finance, insurance, and real estate, emerged as the motors of profitability. This had, as many will know, devastating effects on working class people. From 1960 to 1970, 2.1 million white people left US cities for suburbs, while 2.6 million Black people moved into neighborhoods previously emptied by white flight. Urban renewal programs prioritized private accumulation over public housing, while racialized policing, vagrancy laws, and predatory financing sought to displace people in working class neighborhoods in order to produce their vulnerability to future speculation, clearing the way for the so-called revitalization of these spaces for real estate. And globally, as I argue in my current book project, this long turn had a counter-revolutionary effect. At the same time as countries in the global south were gaining their independence and articulating what a decolonial internationalism might look like through reparative finance, the nationalization of factories, and other protections that were either anti-capitalist or non-capitalist in their conception, firms in the US experimented with loosening regulatory trade and disaggregating supply chains across the globe, dissipating the possibilities for South-South anti-colonial internationalism through a global counter-revolution in logistics and supply distribution. And here I think the work of Deborah Cohen has been really instructive. I think it's also important to note, however, that as Arrighi and Annie McClanahan and others have argued, that while these shifts in accumulation strategies invested in fantasies of frictionless accumulation, in actuality, the post-1973 era was marked not by smooth transitions, but by manic turbulence that characterizes hegemonies in their waning period. From the Asian financial crises of the late 1990s to the great financial crisis of 2008, these periods of disruption are not so much about inventing new forms of futurity as they have been about a deceleration in the real economy or secular stagnation. Whereas capital has withdrawn from long-term and large-scale investments in mass production, new modes of economic production have settled on accumulation through cheap credit, rising consumption, and rising investment in corporate share values. So thinking about this, right, this disruption and disinvestment in relationship, we might approach engineered disruption as the logical result of a half-century-long political project during which the state-capital nexus was investing in the future through financial and logistical markets, while disinvesting in labor, in the social wage, and in ways of imagining distribution beyond the profit motive across the globe. All of this, I think, marks a long movement towards capitalism's crisis tendencies, one that is marked not by a growing economy, but rather by growing economic and political volatility. So this may be a familiar story about the rise of finance capital. But I think we are also witnessing an increasing materialization of so-called fictitious capital in infrastructural forms through new investments in infrastructures and mega projects like the Belt and Road, right? So the question, I think, is why? Why are giant megaships and megaports being built from Mariel, Cuba to Myanmar and beyond? Why did China use more concrete between 2011 and 2013 than the US used in the entire 20th century? Why are a vast number of shiny glass buildings being built in Dubai, in Cairo, in India, and all along the Belt and Road left unfinished? This is a question that my work on infrastructure is currently trying to think through. So I think infrastructure is a concept that would help with some unpacking, right? I think of it as a transversal property claim that involves three elements, and here I've learned from the work of Philip O'Neill. First, it involves a territorialization of space that makes a claim on land or water or underground rights, whether you are moving with a pipeline or a bridge, so forth. Second, it requires regulatory transversality. So it crosses private property lines and needs certain kinds of rights of way that breach other exclusive claims to land use. And third, because of these two elements, the state is always, in a sense, central to the creation of mega infrastructures, right? Infrastructure, because of the way that it requires forms of property and passageway that require these sort of suturing of various modalities of territorial claims, in this sense, cannot be created outside the provenance of the state. And so because of these attributes, infrastructure is somewhat unique in its status as a property claim, as an asset, and as a form of financial capital. The state's role in securing legal and property rights provides legitimacy and security for capital's demand to gain territorial mobility. And the longevity of commercial infrastructure, the iron, the steel, its physical manifestation, right, in a tollable highway or a pipeline that will continue to bring oil to markets, mark, in some sense, its continued capacity to be an enabler for supply chain distribution and an enabler of expanding markets, and therefore its capacity for protected yields over time. This, I think, is important because as a financial asset, the physical materiality of infrastructure is what makes it attractive as a secure revenue stream, right? Unlike fixed capital that is, say, in a factory or site of production, urban flows, so the stuff that flows through infrastructure, are seen as always essential since commercial mobility is constant and the rise of logistics has given us a world of constant supply chain movement. And so once built, existing infrastructure also has few substitutes, right? Once you build one Trans-African highway, for example, it's unlikely others will compete. And so there's a tendency to monopoly. So these attributes of a promise on returns through time becomes extremely lucrative. Now I want to suggest here that the latest efforts to produce these kinds of spectacular infrastructure projects are not a return to investments in productive capacity by any means, but rather their opposite. They are part of a global program for mega infrastructure as one of the key antidotes for sluggish economic growth. Worldwide, regions have been preparing for pipelines of so-called bankable mega projects to implement master plans for infrastructure. And these projects are not reinvestments in the kind of old colonial models of infrastructure, such as dams and mines, which would provide transnational capitalists with access to southern resources and markets. Contemporary mega projects actually argue that investments in infrastructure are a kind of future vision of the global South's development. They are models of structural transformation whose spectacular indication of economic growth, without necessarily an underlying generation of resources, might kickstart investors' faith in a growing economy, thus spurring job creation, green economies, and an increase in the value added in production chains. And so the state and capital found and manage and profit from the explosion of these mega projects, where these infrastructural monuments are not central to national economies or global capital in purely material economic terms, but they are also in some sense projects of modernity, through which cities and nations' hope in successful futures are hinged on projecting their continued relevance and centrality to circuits of global trade. So to return to this question, right, of whether we are now in a world of engineered disruption, I think we must seek to better understand this relationship between megaprojects and financialization. And I've learned from Timothy Mitchell in this regard that the durability that megaprojects perform are the materialization of fragile financialized futures. As he writes in 2014, quote, "Finance capital expanded into a future built upon the new lifespan of infrastructures, charging its flimsy paperwork of financial promises with the durability of iron, steel, copper, and lead, through which it now lived." So in other words, this kind of apparent longevity of infrastructure, right, is sold as a promise on future gain. And investors see financialized infrastructure as an expression of this faith in continued financialized accumulation, even if the particular construction company, let's say, fails to finish the project. That infrastructure can still be repackaged as a financial asset through securitization and debt leveraging, right? And so this scale and longevity of material infrastructure is the foundation, the material foundation from which shareholder value is then sold as a kind of financialized bet on the future. And so what you see behind me is one example of this, Forest City in Malaysia, which was a $100 billion so-called metropolis built by a Chinese company as part of the Belt and Road project that is supposedly be able to accommodate 700,000 people. But when I visited last year in October, was largely empty, the golf courses with practically no one on them. Importantly, as capital has been drawn into these large infrastructures, it flows into projects that weaken rather than enhance the capacities and possibilities for future collective life, right? Into pipelines for oil exports, into privatized airports, into fracking fields that create the kinds of climate catastrophe that we are dealing with today. And so these fixed and immobile infrastructures, increasingly massive in size as they seek to service runaway consumption and the extended infrastructure of circulation, are accompanied by ecological devastation and social upheaval, distributed unevenly across the globe, and effectively shift the cost of disruptive investments in the future in ways that socialize those risks onto society. So in that sense, mega projects also reflect, as Timothy Mitchell argues, a contemporary world in which financial infrastructures allow the accumulation of capital to bypass the work of building durable or productive structures for collective life. So this brings me to my final point, which is a comment on what political projects and potentialities might arise from this age of disruption. Perhaps I think what is most notable about disruption is that it has become a key word of capitalist accumulation at the very moment at which forms of popular disruption, right, uprisings, anti-racist protests, highway blockades, anti-pipeline activism, and so forth, are on the rise. And I think we should then think of two forms of disruption: disruption from above the competitive strategy that seeks to bypass the construction of durable projects through spectacular investments, and disruption from below, the collective refusal that such projects of accumulation should seek, the collective refusal of such projects of accumulation. What I want to suggest about this double meaning that disruption seems to have developed is simply this, that the age of engineered disruption must be understood as a form of counter-revolution. Here I learn from Manu Karuga, Paulo Virno, and Gyan Prakash. Disruption from above, if read in this sense, is ultimately a reactive force, right? One that reorients itself continuously towards delegitimizing these modes of collective refusal, delegitimizing indigenous modes of relationship, laboring solidarities, and anti-colonial insurgencies in all sorts of form, in order to assert the continuation of colonial and capitalist modes of sovereign accumulation. And what we're increasingly finding actually is that the sort of foregrounding of critical infrastructure as something that is a priority of the state increasingly seeks to directly criminalize disruption from below in order to justify disruption from above. But these disruptions from below, right, from the indigenous-led blockades of Standing Rock to rural Indian communities refusing the construction of coal-fired power plants, I think assert themselves as a form of insurgency explicitly erected to impede the power of state and capital from dispossessing, extracting, innovating, and circulating in ways that bypass other forms of being. And so this means, I think, that rather than cede the ground of disruption to its counter-revolutionary forms, we have to struggle over what the meaning of disruption can entail. Rather than allow the colonial capitalist state to seize monopoly over the meaning of what disruption can be, disruption must, I think, be claimed and reclaimed as a site of collective struggle. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.